My name is Michael Jennings, and my life changed in an instant I never saw coming. It hit me like a bolt of lightning out of a clear sky, and honestly, I wasn't prepared for any of it. I've been married to Kate for 18 years, and during that time, we built what I thought was a solid, happy family. We have three kids: Zach, Sophie, and Emma. We live in a comfortable house in the suburbs, the kind of place where you feel safe, secure, and settled. I've worked hard to provide for my family, and Kate has always been there, holding everything together at home. From the outside looking in, we had it all. But now I realize how little I actually knew. Zach, our oldest, has always been an active kid. He's the kind of boy who never sits still, always playing baseball, hanging out with friends, or dreaming big about the future. He was full of energy, and we were so proud of the young man he was becoming. But about a year ago, things started to change, and we couldn't ignore it anymore. At first, we brushed off the signs: headaches, fatigue, the usual teenage stuff, right? He was still growing, still pushing himself hard, and we figured he was just overdoing it. But it kept getting worse. He'd come home from practice, collapse on the couch, and tell us he felt like he was hit by a truck. And one day, he just fainted. We rushed him to the hospital that night, hearts pounding, and they ran all kinds of tests on him. For a few days, we didn't know what was happening, but when the results came back, it was like a punch to the gut. The doctors told us that Zach had a rare genetic disorder, something we'd never even heard of before. I couldn't even process it at first. A genetic disorder? How? Why? They explained that it affected his immune system and was something he'd inherited from his father's side. At that moment, I didn't think much of it. I just wanted to know how we could help him, how we could fix it. That's when everything changed. The doctor said they needed to run more tests on me to see if I could be a match for treatment or even a donor. I nodded and said, "Of course. I'm his father." But when the results came back, the doctor called me into his office. I'll never forget the way he looked at me, like he was trying to figure out how to break bad news, the kind you never want to hear. He said the words, but they didn't sink in right away. "You're not a match." I remember blinking, feeling confused, and saying, "What do you mean?" "I'm his father." The doctor's face softened, and that's when he said something that knocked the wind out of me. "Biologically, you're not Zach's father." I can't even explain what happened in my head at that moment. It felt like the room was spinning. Everything went quiet. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even think straight. How could this be? I looked at the doctor like maybe he'd made a mistake, like this wasn't real. I kept telling myself that there had to be some explanation. But deep down, I already knew. I walked out of the office in a daze, replaying the doctor's words over and over in my head. I kept thinking, this can't be happening. This has to be some kind of mix-up. But it wasn't. I drove home that day in silence. Kate was there when I got back, and I could see the worry in her eyes. She asked me how the tests went, but I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. I felt like my entire world had just shattered, and I didn't know how to put it into words. I finally looked at her and said, "The doctor says I'm not Zach's biological father." Her face froze. I saw something shift in her eyes, something I hadn't seen before, and in that moment, I knew. I didn't need her to say anything. The truth was written all over her face. I was right. Kate, the woman I'd loved and trusted for nearly 2 decades, had been keeping this secret from me for over 16 years. Zach wasn't mine. I couldn't breathe. I felt like my heart had been ripped out of my chest. Every memory of Zach's childhood, every birthday, every baseball game, it all felt like a lie. The ground beneath me was slipping away, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I stared at her, waiting for her to explain, waiting for her to say something that could make this hurt less. But she just stood there, silent, as if words had abandoned her. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "It was a long time ago, Michael. Before Zach was born. Before Zach was born." Those words echoed in my head. I stood there staring at Kate, not even sure what to feel. Anger, betrayal, confusion. Everything hit me at once, and I didn't know how to react. She took a step closer, reaching out to me like she wanted to explain, but I pulled back. I couldn't bear to have her touch me. Not now. Not after what I just learned. Michael, please, she began, her voice trembling. It was a mistake. It happened a long time ago, and I didn't mean for it to turn out this way. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. My mind was racing, trying to process everything. How could she keep this from me for so long? How could she let me believe Zach was mine all these years? The boy I had raised, loved, and cherished as my own. He wasn't even my son. I thought you would never find out, she continued, tears forming in her eyes. I never wanted to hurt you, Michael. I never wanted it to come to this. It felt like my head was spinning. I couldn't look at her. I couldn't even think straight. All I could do was replay everything in my mind. The day Zach was born, the first time I held him in my arms, the sleepless nights when he was sick, the countless games of catch in the backyard. All of it. It was all based on a lie. Who? I finally managed to ask, my voice hoarse. Who is his father? Kate hesitated, and I could see the fear in her eyes. She didn't want to tell me, but I needed to know. I deserved to know. It was Tom, she whispered, barely able to get the words out. Tom Pierce. Tom Pierce, of course. Of course, it was him. My best friend, the man I had trusted with everything, the man who had been a part of my life for as long as I could remember. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. How could he do this to me? How could they both betray me like this? I turned away from her, trying to gather my thoughts. Tom. The same Tom who had been there for every one of Zach's birthday parties. The same Tom who had coached Zach's little league team with me. The man who had stood beside me through every major moment in my life. My best man at our wedding, for God's sake. I clenched my fists, feeling my chest tighten. I wanted to scream. I wanted to hit something. But instead, I just stood there, silent, as the weight of the betrayal crashed down on me. Kate was crying now, her hands covering her face. I didn't care, not right now. I couldn't feel anything except the burning anger building up inside of me. How long? I asked, my voice cold. She wiped her tears and looked at me, shaking her head. It was just once, Michael. It was a long time ago, before we had Zach. I was scared. Scared that we wouldn't be able to have children. You were so focused on work, and I made a mistake. I'm so sorry. A mistake. She kept calling it a mistake. But it didn't feel like a mistake to me. It felt like the ultimate betrayal. She had cheated on me with my best friend and lied about it for 16 years. How was that just a mistake? Does he know? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I was afraid of the answer, afraid that Tom knew all this time and never said a word. Kate shook her head. Number, he doesn't know. I never told him. I never told anyone. I couldn't tell if she was telling the truth or not. At this point, I didn't know if I could believe anything that came out of her mouth. But for now, I had to focus. I had to figure out what to do next. I walked over to the couch and sat down, my head in my hands. Everything felt like it was falling apart, and I didn't know how to stop it. The woman I loved, the life I thought we had, it was all a lie. And now I had to figure out what to do with that. Michael, please, Kate pleaded, kneeling beside me. We can get through this. I love you. You're the only man I've ever loved. Zach is your son. Maybe not biologically, but you're his father in every way that matters. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Deep down, I knew she was right. Zach was my son. I was the one who had raised him, been there for him through everything. But knowing that didn't make the pain any less real. I need some time, I finally said, standing up. I need to think. Kate nodded, tears still streaming down her face. I understand. I'll give you whatever time you need. I grabbed my keys and walked out the door, not sure where I was going or what I was going to do. I just knew I couldn't be there. Not right now. As I drove, my mind kept drifting back to Zach. He was still in the hospital, still fighting this disease. And now I knew I couldn't give him what he needed. I wasn't his match. I wasn't his father. But that didn't mean I could just walk away. I drove aimlessly for a while, the streets all blending together in my mind as the weight of everything pressed down on me. How could life change so fast? 1 minute, I'm Zach's father, Kate's husband, and a man who knows his place in the world. And now? Now I didn't even know who I was. I ended up at the park, You know, the one where Zach and I used to go when he was little. We'd bring his glove and baseball, and we'd spend hours there. Just the two of us. I remember the way his face lit up every time I tossed the ball. That pure, innocent joy. It didn't matter how tired I was from work or what was going on in the world. When I was with Zach, everything felt right. I sat on one of the benches staring at the baseball field. The memories hit me like a wave, and for a brief moment, I felt that familiar warmth, being Zach's dad, being the one he looked up to. But then reality came crashing back down. I wasn't really his dad, at least not in the way I thought, and Kate, God, how could she do this to me? I kept replaying the conversation in my head over and over. Tom Pierce, my best friend. The betrayal stung. But what hurt even more was the fact that I hadn't seen it. How blind had I been? How could I have missed the signs? I pulled out my phone, staring at the screen. My finger hovered over Tom's contact. I should call him, I thought. Demand answers. Scream at him. But instead, I just sat there, frozen. What was I supposed to say? Hey man, turns out you're Zach's biological father. Thanks for ruining my life. Number, I couldn't do it. Not yet. I wasn't ready to face him. I wasn't ready to face any of this. Instead, I thought about Zach. He was still in that hospital bed, battling a disease he never asked for. And I was supposed to be there for him. I should have been at his side, not driving around lost in my own mess. But how could I face him? How could I look at him and not feel like a fraud? I stayed at the park for what felt like hours. At some point, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Kate. Kate, Michael, please come home. We need to talk more. Zach will be asking about you. I don't know what to tell him. I stared at the screen, torn between the instinct to go back and the overwhelming need to get as far away as possible. What was I going to say to Zach? He had no idea what was going on. He trusted me, and I was supposed to be his rock through this. I stood up from the bench, running a hand through my hair. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of what to do next. I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't avoid it forever. I had to go back. I had to face this. I got back into the car and drove to the hospital. As I walked through the sterile hallways, the smell of antiseptic in the air. Everything felt too real, too heavy. When I reached Zach's room, I hesitated for a second outside the door. I could hear Kate's voice softly talking to him, trying to comfort him like a good mother would. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. Zach's face lit up when he saw me, and for a moment, that warmth I'd felt at the park came rushing back. I smiled, trying to hide the storm raging inside me. Hey, buddy, I said, walking over to his bed. How you feeling? Pretty bored, he replied with a grin. They've got me hooked up to all this stuff, and I can't even move. You know, they should really put a TV in here or something. Give a guy some entertainment, I chuckled, sitting down in the chair beside him. Kate was standing off to the side, her eyes on me, filled with guilt and worry. But I couldn't focus on her right now. All I could think about was Zach. I'll see if I can talk to someone about getting a TV in here, and I joked, trying to keep my tone light. But inside, everything was spinning. I looked at my son, and tried to process what I'd just learned. How could I look at him and not see him as mine? How are the tests going? I asked, trying to shift the conversation. Zach shrugged. The doctors said they're still running some tests. Mom told me that they're doing some genetic stuff too, whatever that means. Guess they're just making sure I'm as awesome on the inside as I am on the outside. His joke hit me like a ton of bricks. Genetic stuff. He had no idea. No clue that those tests were unraveling everything I thought I knew about him, about myself, about our family. I forced a smile. Yeah, you're one of a kind, kiddo. Zach smiled back, and for a second, everything felt almost normal. But then, Kate cleared her throat and the tension in the room grew thick. She glanced at me, her eyes pleading for some kind of forgiveness, some kind of understanding. I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. I need to step outside for a bit, I said abruptly, standing up. Just need some fresh air. Zach looked confused, but he nodded. Okay, Dad. The word dad hit me in the gut. I walked out of the room quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. I felt like I was going to explode. I couldn't do this. I couldn't pretend everything was fine when it wasn't. I found myself standing in the hospital parking lot, staring up at the sky. Everything felt so out of control, like I was in a free fall and there was no safety net to catch me. I thought about what Kate had said earlier. Zach is your son. Maybe not biologically, but in every way that matters. Maybe she was right. But how was I supposed to reconcile that with everything I'd just learned? How was I supposed to be the father Zach needed when I wasn't even sure who I was anymore? I stood in the hospital parking lot, staring blankly at the cars moving in and out, my mind still spinning. The weight of everything was suffocating. I had always thought of myself as a strong guy, the kind of man who could handle anything life threw at him, but this was different. How do you recover from something like this? How do you look at the people you love and not feel completely broken? I kept thinking about Zach. He was lying in that hospital bed, battling a disease he never asked for. And here I was, unraveling. And Kate, my wife of 18 years, was falling apart in her own way. She'd lied to me, yes, but I knew this was killing her too. I wasn't ready to forgive her, but part of me couldn't help but feel the weight of her pain pressing down on me too. I pulled my phone out of my pocket again, scrolling through my contacts. Tom Pierce's name glared back at me. Every part of me wanted to call him, to demand an explanation, to confront him about what he'd done. But what would that solve? Was I ready for that conversation? Hell, I didn't even know what I'd say if he picked up the phone. Instead, I shoved the phone back into my pocket and leaned against the hood of my car, breathing in the cool evening air. The hospital's soft, sterile glow cast a strange light over the lot, making everything feel surreal. It was like I was living in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Suddenly, I felt a presence next to me. I looked over to see Kate standing there, arms crossed, eyes red from crying. She looked like she'd been through hell, but I wasn't about to feel sorry for her. Not yet. Michael, she said softly, almost hesitantly. Can we talk? I nodded, even though I wasn't sure I wanted to. The truth was, there wasn't anything else I could do. We had to figure this out, one way or another. She walked over and leaned against the car next to me, staring off into the distance. For a long time, neither of us said anything. The silence was heavy, but I didn't know how to break it. Finally, Kate spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I know you hate me right now, she began, her eyes still fixed on the darkening horizon. I don't blame you. I hate myself, too. I didn't respond. I just let her talk. I made a mistake, she continued, her voice breaking. I made a terrible, selfish mistake all those years ago, and I've regretted it every single day since. I thought I could keep it buried, that it would never come out. But it was always there, in the back of my mind, eating away at me. Her words hung in the air, and I felt a sharp pang in my chest. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that this was just some mistake, a lapse in judgment, but the betrayal still burned too hot. Why didn't you tell me? I finally asked, my voice harsher than I intended. Why didn't you give me the chance to know the truth from the beginning? Kate wiped at her eyes, sniffling as she tried to find the words. I didn't want to lose you. I didn't want to lose us. And then, when Zach was born, you were so happy. You loved him so much. And I thought, what good would it do to destroy that? You were his father in every way that mattered, Michael. I thought, maybe it didn't matter that he wasn't yours biologically. Maybe we could just move on. I shook my head, frustration building inside me. But it does matter, Kate. It matters because you lied. You let me believe something that wasn't true for 16 years. You didn't give me the choice. Her face crumpled and she looked down at the ground. I know, she whispered. I know. I was scared. I was afraid you'd leave. I didn't know what else to do. I felt a bitter laugh rise in my throat. And what about Tom? Does he know? Kate shook her head vigorously. Number, I never told him. He has no idea. That was the one small piece of relief I felt. At least Tom hadn't been walking around all these years, knowing that Zach was his son while I had no clue. But that didn't make this any easier. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said quietly, almost more to myself than to her. She nodded, her eyes filling with fresh tears. I understand, she whispered. I just hope one day, maybe you can. I wasn't sure if that was possible. Not now. Maybe not ever. We stood there in silence for a few more minutes, neither of us knowing what to say. The sun had set completely by now, and the parking lot was bathed in the dim, artificial glow of the streetlights. It felt cold, empty, just like everything inside me. Finally, Kate spoke again, her voice so soft I almost didn't hear her. You're still Zach's father, Michael. That hasn't changed. You've been there for him his whole life. He needs you now more than ever. I knew she was right. No matter what had happened, no matter the lies or the betrayal, Zach was still my son. I had been there for him since the day he was born. I had raised him, taught him, loved him. None of that had changed. But how could I just pretend like nothing had happened? How could I go back to being the father Zach needed when everything felt so broken? I'll be there for him, I said finally, my voice steady. But I don't know what happens with us, Kate. I don't know if we can come back from this. Her face fell, but she nodded. I understand, she whispered. With that, she turned and walked back toward the hospital, leaving me alone in the parking lot, staring up at the sky and wondering how the hell my life had ended up like this. I stood in the parking lot for what felt like hours after Kate walked away. The night air was cool, but it did little to calm the storm inside me. I knew I had to go back inside to face everything, but I just couldn't bring myself to move. My legs felt like they were rooted to the spot, and my mind was racing in a million directions. How was I supposed to keep being Zach's father when I didn't even know who I was anymore? How could I be there for him when every time I looked at him, all I could think about was the betrayal? It wasn't his fault, I knew that. He was just a kid. My kid. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being utterly deceived. Eventually, I forced myself to walk back into the hospital. The sterile scent of disinfectant hit me as soon as the automatic doors slid open. It was like stepping back into reality after being stuck in some kind of limbo. I made my way to Zach's room, my footsteps heavy, my heart even heavier. When I opened the door, Zach was lying there, staring up at the ceiling. He looked tired, drained, like the weight of his illness was starting to wear on him. Kate was sitting by his side, holding his hand, her face still tear-streaked. She glanced up at me when I walked in, but we didn't exchange any words. Hey, Dad, Zach said, his voice weak but warm. He tried to smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. I was wondering where you went. I forced a smile in return, though it felt hollow. Just needed some fresh air, buddy. I sat down in the chair on the other side of the bed, the one I'd sat in 100 times before. It felt familiar, comforting in a way, but everything about this moment was different. I looked at Zach, his brown hair tousled, his eyes a little too tired, his hands too still. My son, I reminded myself. He's my son. But the words felt strange, foreign, like I had to convince myself of their truth. We sat in silence for a while. The beeping of the machines, the only sound filling the room. Kate kept her gaze fixed on Zach, avoiding eye contact with me. It was like we were both too afraid to say anything, too afraid to break the fragile peace that had settled in the room. Eventually, Zach spoke up, his voice quiet but filled with the kind of strength I didn't think I had anymore. Mom told me they're still running some tests to figure everything out. He paused, glancing between the two of us. But they said it's genetic. Something about it being passed down from you, Dad. The knot in my stomach tightened. This was the moment I had been dreading. He didn't know. He had no idea what was really going on. I glanced at Kate and I could see the panic in her eyes, the silent plea for me to keep it together. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Yeah, they're just trying to figure out the best way to help you, I said, carefully choosing my words. But we're going to get through this, okay? No matter what, we'll figure it out. Zach nodded, but I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. He was smart, smarter than I gave him credit for sometimes. He could sense that something was off, that there was more going on than we were telling him. I trust you, he said after a moment, his eyes meeting mine. You've always been there for me, Dad. You'll figure this out. His words hit me harder than I expected. I felt a lump form in my throat, and I had to blink back the sudden sting of tears. He trusted me. He still looked up to me, even though everything I thought I knew had crumbled around me. And in that moment, I realized something. No matter what the DNA tests said, no matter what had happened between Kate and Tom, Zach was mine. He had to be. I'd raised him, taught him everything he knew, been there for him every step of the way. Nothing could take that away, but there was still this nagging voice in the back of my mind. The voice that kept reminding me of the lie, the betrayal, the fact that I wasn't his biological father. And I couldn't ignore that. Not yet. "I'll always be here for you, Zach," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "No matter what happens, I'll always be here." He smiled at me, that same boyish grin that I had seen 1,000 times before. It was the kind of smile that had always made everything feel okay, like the world wasn't as heavy as it seemed. But this time, it didn't work. Not for me, at least. Kate shifted in her chair, her eyes flicking toward me for just a second. I knew what she was thinking, that I had just promised something I wasn't sure I could keep, that I had said the words she wanted to hear, but didn't believe myself. The truth was, I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if I could ever forgive her, or if we could ever move past this. But right now, Zach was all that mattered. He needed me, and I couldn't let him down. After a while, a nurse came in to check on Zach. She smiled at us, her demeanor professional but kind. "He's doing well," she said, glancing at the machines. "It'll take time, but he's strong." I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I believed her. Strong? Maybe. But was I? The nurse finished up and left, leaving the three of us in silence again. I looked over at Kate, and for the first time since I'd found out the truth, I saw the person I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. She looked tired, broken, but still the same woman I had built a life with. And that life, no matter how messed up it felt now, was real. It had to be. But could we save it? Could I? Zach closed his eyes, exhaustion finally overtaking him. I stood up, giving Kate a nod before quietly leaving the room. I needed to get out of there, to clear my head again. As I walked down the hallway, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Tom. I froze, staring at the screen. My best friend, the man who had unknowingly fathered my son, the man I had trusted with everything. I didn't answer. I stared at the phone in my hand, Tom's name still flashing on the screen. My instinct was to throw the phone across the hall, to avoid the confrontation I knew was coming. But I couldn't avoid it forever. Eventually, I'd have to face him. Eventually, I'd have to hear what he had to say, and I'd have to figure out what to do with the anger that had been simmering inside me ever since Kate said his name. I let the call go to voicemail. I wasn't ready yet. Not for that conversation. The hallways of the hospital felt like they were closing in on me, the sterile smell making it hard to breathe. I needed air. I needed space. I pushed open the door and stepped outside, the cool night air hitting me like a slap to the face. I took a deep breath, trying to clear my mind, but it wasn't working. The weight of everything was still there, crushing me from the inside. My phone buzzed again, but this time it was a text. "Tom, hey man, can we talk? It's important." I shoved the phone back into my pocket. What was I supposed to say? "Sure, let's talk about how you fathered my son without either of us knowing." The thought made me feel sick. I wasn't ready, not yet. I paced the parking lot for what felt like hours, going over everything in my head. How did I get here? How had my life gone from normal, no, better than normal, to this? The lies, the betrayal. It was too much to process all at once. Eventually, I stopped pacing and leaned against the side of my car. I could still see the hospital entrance from where I stood, the soft glow of the lights reminding me that Zach was still in there, still waiting for answers that I couldn't give him. I felt helpless, completely out of control. And that was the worst part. I'd always been the guy who had a plan, who knew what to do next. But now, I didn't have a damn clue. My phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't Tom. "Kate, where are you? Zach's asking for you." I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. I didn't know how I was going to face Zach again, but I knew I couldn't just leave him. Not now. He needed me. He needed his dad. even if that word felt like it didn't belong to me anymore. I typed a quick reply. Be there in a minute. The walk back into the hospital felt heavy, like every step was taking more energy than I had. When I reached Zach's room, I hesitated at the door, gathering myself before stepping inside. Zach was awake, his eyes tired but alert. He smiled when he saw me, and it was like nothing had changed. For him, I was still his dad. I was still the guy who had been there for every scraped knee, every school play, every baseball game. And in that moment, I realized something. I couldn't let my anger, my confusion, or even my pain take that away from him. He didn't deserve that. Hey, buddy, I said, sitting down in the chair beside him. Hey, Zach replied, his voice soft. You were gone for a while. Everything okay? I forced a smile. Yeah, just had to clear my head for a bit. How are you feeling? He shrugged. Tired, mostly. They're still running tests, but Mom says I'll be okay. I nodded, trying to focus on him and not the weight of everything hanging between me and Kate. You will be okay. We're going to figure this out. Zach's eyes met mine, and for a second I saw a flash of something. Something like doubt or maybe fear. Dad, he started, his voice hesitant. Is there something you're not telling me? The question hit me like a punch to the gut. He could sense it. He could feel the tension between Kate and me, the weight of the truth hanging over all of us. I swallowed hard, trying to figure out how to answer him. Before I could speak, Kate chimed in. Zach, honey, we're just worried about you, that's all. We've been through a lot lately, and we're all trying to process everything. Zach didn't look convinced, but he nodded anyway, too tired to push it any further. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but I knew it was temporary. Sooner or later, we'd have to tell him the truth. Sooner or later, he'd know. I'm going to get some rest, Zach said, his voice thick with exhaustion. You guys should too. Kate smiled at him, brushing a strand of hair off his forehead. We will. You get some sleep, sweetie. He nodded, already closing his eyes, and within minutes, he was asleep again. The room fell into silence, the steady beeping of the machines the only sound. I glanced at Kate, who was still sitting on the edge of the bed, her eyes filled with guilt and something else. Maybe hope. But I wasn't ready for that, not yet. We need to tell him, I said quietly, not meeting her eyes. Kate looked up at me, her expression one of fear and pain. Michael, he's not ready for that. He's sick. He's been through so much already. I shook my head. We can't keep this from him forever. He deserves to know the truth. She looked down, her hands trembling slightly. I know, but I don't want to lose him. Her words hit me hard. I knew what she meant. Telling Zach the truth could change everything. It could tear apart the bond we had built, the relationship that had defined so much of my life. But he had the right to know. He had the right to decide for himself what this meant. We'll lose him more if we keep lying, I said, my voice firm but low. Kate didn't respond. She just nodded, her eyes still downcast, as if she knew I was right but couldn't bring herself to face it. I stood up, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me again. I'm going to step outside for a bit. Kate nodded, not looking up. I walked out of the room, my heart heavy, my mind spinning. The hospital halls felt endless as I wandered through them, lost in thought. Eventually, I found myself back in the parking lot, staring up at the sky, wondering how long it would take before this nightmare ended, before I found some way to make sense of it all. And then my phone buzzed again, another text. Tom. Please, Michael. We need to talk. I stared at the message for a long time. I knew I couldn't avoid him forever. I knew that conversation was coming, but right now I wasn't ready to face Tom Pierce. Not yet. The sky was darkening and the cool night air felt sharp against my skin as I stared at my phone. Tom's message glowed on the screen like a reminder of everything I'd been trying to avoid. I knew I couldn't keep running from this forever, but right now, I wasn't ready to hear his voice, to hear his side of things. I stuffed my phone back into my pocket and walked toward my car. My thoughts kept bouncing between Zach and Tom, the boy who still believed I was his father, and the man who had unknowingly taken that place from me. The one thing I knew for sure was that none of this was Zach's fault. And as much as I wanted to scream, to throw something, to let the anger out, I couldn't let it touch him. I leaned against the hood of my car, breathing in the night air and trying to calm the storm inside me. Tom. How had I not seen it? How had I missed the fact that my best friend, the guy who had been there for everything, our wedding, Zach's birthdays, countless weekends, had been a part of this betrayal? Or maybe I just didn't want to see it. Maybe the signs had always been there, but I had been too trusting, too naive to think that the two people I cared about the most could have kept such a secret from me. My phone buzzed again, and I pulled it out, half expecting it to be Tom again, but it wasn't. It was Kate. Kate. Michael, please come back inside. We need to talk. I knew we had to talk. I knew we had to figure out what to do next. But every conversation with her felt like stepping on broken glass. Each word was a reminder of what we'd lost, what we couldn't get back. Still, Zach was inside, and I needed to be there for him, even if I didn't have all the answers yet. I pushed myself off the car and walked back into the hospital, the lights harsh and cold as I made my way through the hallways. When I reached Zach's room, I hesitated at the door, gathering myself before stepping inside. The room was quiet, dimly lit, with only the soft hum of the machines filling the silence. Kate was sitting in the chair next to Zach's bed, her head resting in her hands. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes red from crying. She stood up as I approached, and I could see the guilt etched into every line of her face. "Michael," she whispered, her voice fragile, as if it could break at any moment. "I know this is hard. I know I've hurt you in ways I can never take back, but we need to talk about what's next. About Zach." I nodded, though I didn't trust myself to speak just yet. The anger, the betrayal, it was still there, bubbling beneath the surface, but I couldn't let it control me. Not when Zach needed me to be the strong one. Kate took a deep breath. "He's getting better, slowly. But the doctors are still concerned. They're going to need more tests, and, Michael, we need to be prepared. They might need something from a biological match." Her words hung in the air, and I felt the weight of them settle deep in my chest. A biological match. She meant Tom. The thought made my stomach turn, but I knew she was right. If it came down to it, we'd have to tell Tom the truth. We'd have to let him know about Zach. "I don't want to tell him," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to give him that. I don't want him to take what's mine." Kate's eyes softened, and she stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm. "Michael, no one can take away what you've built with Zach. He's your son, no matter what the DNA says. But if it comes down to his health, to saving his life, we have to be honest." I looked at her, the woman I had loved for so long, the woman who had lied to me for 16 years, and I felt the bitterness rise up again. But she was right. As much as it killed me, she was right. "We'll do what's best for Zach," I said, my voice hard but resolute. "But this doesn't change anything between us. We may have to tell Tom, but it doesn't mean I forgive you. It doesn't mean I'll ever forgive you." Kate flinched at my words, and for a moment I almost regretted them. But then I remembered the years of deception, the lies that had piled up over time, and I knew I couldn't let myself soften. Not now. Not when the wound was still so raw. "Whatever happens," Kate said quietly, "I'll accept it. I'll accept whatever you decide about us. But please, just don't let Zach suffer because of my mistakes." I nodded, though it felt like a hollow gesture. I wasn't ready to think about what came next for us. Right now, all I could focus on was Zach and the uphill battle he was facing. As we stood there in the dim light of the hospital room, the weight of our choices pressing down on both of us, I realized something. No matter how much I hated what Kate had done, no matter how much I wanted to walk away from all of it, I couldn't. Zach needed me, and as much as it hurt, I wasn't going to let him down. Kate sat back down in the chair, her hands trembling slightly as she reached out to take Zach's hand. I watched her, feeling a strange mix of anger and sorrow. She was still the mother of my children, the woman I'd built a life with, but now, everything felt like it was hanging by a thread. I walked over to the window, staring out into the darkness. The night stretched on, endless and cold, much like the road ahead of us. I didn't know how we were going to get through this, how I was going to get through this. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let Zach pay the price for our mistakes. The silence in the room was thick, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. I could feel Kate's eyes on me, but I didn't turn around. I didn't trust myself to look at her, without letting all of the anger, all of the pain, come rushing to the surface. My phone buzzed again, and this time, I knew I couldn't ignore it. It was Tom. Again. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen for a moment, before I finally opened the message. Tom. Michael, I know something's wrong. Please call me. We need to talk. The pit in my stomach deepened. There was no avoiding it anymore. I couldn't keep running from this, no matter how much I wanted to. I turned away from the window and looked at Kate. I'm going to call him. Her eyes widened, and for a moment I saw fear flash across her face, but she nodded, knowing it had to be done. Okay, she whispered. I stepped out of the room, my heart pounding as I dialed Tom's number. The phone rang once, twice, and then I heard his voice on the other end. Michael, what's going on, man? You've been dodging my calls. Is everything okay? I took a deep breath, my hand tightening around the phone. No, Tom, everything's not okay. The silence on the other end of the phone was palpable. I could hear Tom breathing, waiting for me to explain, but the words caught in my throat. How do you tell your best friend that he's the biological father of your son? How do you even begin to unpack that kind of betrayal? Michael? Tom's voice was quieter now, cautious. What's going on? I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady, but the anger and confusion boiled just beneath the surface. We need to talk, Tom, about something big, something that's going to change everything. There was a pause, and I could hear him shifting on the other end of the line. All right, I'm listening. I pressed my palm against my forehead, squeezing my eyes shut, feeling the weight of every word I was about to say. It's about Zach. There's something I found out recently that I didn't want to believe, something that I can barely even say out loud. I heard Tom shift again, his tone growing more concerned. Is Zach okay? Is he sick? I almost wished that were the only problem, that we could just focus on Zach's health, on the battle he was fighting. But there was more, so much more. He's sick, yes, I replied, trying to keep the emotion from breaking my voice. But it's what the doctors found out that changes everything. They found out that Zach, he has a rare genetic condition, something that's inherited. They needed to run some tests to figure out where it came from, and Tom. I trailed off, my breath catching in my throat. What, Michael? What are you trying to say? His voice was edged with panic now, but he still didn't know. He still had no idea how deeply this would cut. They ran tests on me, Tom, and the results, they showed that I'm not Zach's biological father. The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just been dropped, the kind of truth you can't take back once it's been said. I could feel my hands trembling, my heart pounding so loudly that it drowned out everything else. What? Tom's voice was barely a whisper. That doesn't make any sense. You've been his dad his whole life. I know that, I snapped, the frustration and anger bubbling up again. But I'm not his biological father. Kate had an affair, Tom. 16 years ago. And now I know. You're Zach's biological father. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear Tom breathing, but he didn't say a word. The shock of what I had just told him must have hit him like a freight train, just like it had hit me when I first found out. No, he said finally, his voice shaking. No, that can't be right. I mean, Kate and it was a mistake, Michael. It was one time, and I never thought. His voice trailed off, and I could hear the disbelief, the guilt sinking in. It doesn't matter if it was a mistake, Tom. It happened. And now Zach is sick, and the doctors might need you to step in because I can't. I'm not a match, but you might be. My words were cold, even though I was trying to hold it together. Jesus Christ, Tom muttered. I could hear him pacing now, his breathing heavy. I didn't know. I swear to you, Michael, I didn't know. If I had known, I don't know what I would have done. Yeah, well, now you do know, I said bitterly, and I don't care what you would have done back then. What matters now is what we do next. Zach needs help, and he's your son, Tom, not mine. Don't say that, Tom said quickly, his voice desperate. You've been his father all these years. You've raised him, Michael. That doesn't change just because of some DNA test. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the flood of emotions threatening to drown me. That's easy for you to say, I muttered. You didn't have to live this lie for 16 years. I'm sorry, Tom whispered, and I could hear the genuine remorse in his voice. I'm so sorry, Michael. I never wanted this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you or Kate or Zach. I don't even know what to say. Just do what needs to be done, I said, my voice heavy with exhaustion. The doctors might need you for testing. If you can help Zach, then you need to step up. I will, Tom said quickly. Of course I will. I'll do whatever it takes, whatever Zach needs. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Good. There was a long silence on the line, the weight of everything hanging between us like an invisible barrier. I didn't know if we could ever come back from this, if our friendship could survive. But right now, that didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was Zach. Michael, Tom said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. I know this doesn't fix anything, but I'm going to make this right. Whatever it takes, I'll be there for Zach. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat felt tight, and the anger I had been holding on to for so long was starting to shift, replaced by something else. Something I wasn't ready to deal with yet. I'll let the doctors know, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. They'll contact you for the tests. Okay, Tom replied, his voice steady now. Just keep me posted, all right? Yeah, I will. I hung up the phone and stood there, staring at the darkened parking lot. The conversation I had been dreading for so long was finally over, but it didn't bring the relief I'd hoped for. Instead, it left me feeling even more hollow, like a piece of me had been chipped away that I would never get back. I walked back into the hospital, my feet heavy with the weight of everything that had just happened. When I reached Zach's room, I paused outside the door, listening to the soft hum of the machines inside. Kate was still sitting by his side, holding his hand. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes full of questions. Did you talk to him? She asked quietly. I nodded, but didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. She glanced down at Zach, her expression filled with a mixture of love and guilt. What now? She whispered. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. We wait. And we hope. Kate nodded, her hand trembling slightly as she brushed a lock of hair off Zach's forehead. He was still asleep, blissfully unaware of the storm that had been raging around him. I sat down in the chair next to Kate, the two of us sitting in silence, as the weight of everything we had lost settled around us. There was no going back, no undoing the mistakes we had made, the lies we had told. But as I looked at Zach, my son, no matter what the DNA said, I realized that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be quick. But for Zach, for the boy I had raised, it was worth the fight. We just had to find a way to make it through.